Section 38 of Rudder, Grange. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rudder, Grange by Frank R. Stockton. Chapter 19. The Baby at Rudder Grange, Part 2. I went to the stable and harnessed the horse to the little carriage. Jonas was not there, and I had fallen out of the habit of calling him. I drove slowly through the yard and out of the gate. No one called to me or asked where I was going. How different this was from the old times! Then someone would not have failed to know where I was going, and in all probability she would have gone with me. But now I drove away, quietly and undisturbed. About 3 miles from our house was a settlement known as New Dublin. It was a cluster of poor and doleful houses, inhabited entirely by Irish people, whose dirt and poverty seemed to make them very contented and happy. The men were generally away at their work during the day, but there was never any difficulty in finding someone at home, no matter at what house one called. I was acquainted with one of the matrons of this locality, a Mrs. Duffy, who had occasionally undertaken some odd jobs at our house, and to her I made a visit. She was glad to see me, and wiped off a chair for me. "Mrs. Duffy," said I want to rent a baby." At first the good woman could not understand me, but when I made it plain to her that I wished for a short time to obtain the exclusive use and control of a baby, for which I was willing to pay a liberal rental, she burst into long and violent laughter. It seemed to her like a person coming into the country to purchase weeds. Weeds and children were so abundant in New Dublin. But she gradually began to see that I was in earnest, and as she knew I was a trusty person, and somewhat noted for the care I took of my livestock, she was perfectly willing to accommodate me, but feared she had nothing on hand of the age I desired. "My child are all a-going about," she said. "You can see a poile of them out yon in the road, and there's more of 'em in the fence. But ye need have a fear about gettin' one. There's thacks of 'em in the place. I'll just run over to Mrs. Hogan's wid ye. She's got 16 or 17, mostly small, for Hogan bought 4 or 5 wid him when he married her, and she'll be glad to rent one of 'em." So, throwing her apron over her head, she accompanied me to Mrs. Hogan's. That lady was washing, but she cheerfully stopped her work while Mrs. Duffy took her to one side and explained my errand. Mrs. Hogan did not appear to be able to understand why I wanted a baby, especially for so limited a period, but probably concluded that if I would take good care of it and would pay well for it, the matter was my own affair, for she soon came and said that if I wanted a baby I'd come to the right place. Then she began to consider what one she would let me have. I insisted on a young one. There was already a little baby at our house, and the folks would know how to manage it. "Oh, you want it for company for the other one, is that it?" said Mrs. Hogan, a new light breaking in upon her. "And that's a good plan, sure. It must be dreadful lonely in a little house with only one baby. Now there's one. Polly, would she do?" "Why, she can run," I said. "I don't want one that can run." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Hogan with a sigh. "They all begin to run very early. Now Polly isn't old at all. "I can see that," I said, "but I want one you can put in a cradle, one that will have to stay there when you put it in." It was plain that Mrs. Hogan's present stock did not contain exactly what I wanted, and directly Mrs. Duffy exclaimed, "There's Mary McCann, and right across the way." Mrs. Hogan said, "Yis, sure," and we all went over to a little house opposite. "Now then," said Mrs. Duffy, entering the house and proudly drawing a small coverlid from a little box bed in a corner, "what do you think of that?" "Why, there are 2 of them," I exclaimed. "To be sure," said Mrs. Duffy, "they're tweens, and there's always 2 of 'em when there's tweens, and they're young enough." "Yes," said I doubtfully, "but I couldn't take them both. Do you think their mother would rent one of them?" The women shook their heads. "You see, sir," said Mrs. Hogan, "Mary McCann isn't here, being gone out to a wash, but she only has 4 or 5 children, and she ain't much used to 'em yet, and I can speak for her that she'd never separate a pair of tweens. When she gets a dozen herself, and marries a widow gentleman wid a lot of his own, she'll be glad enough to be lettin' you have your pick, to take one of 'em for company to your own baby, at $5 a week. Mind that." I visited several houses after this, still in company with Mrs. Hogan and Mrs. Duffy, and finally secured a youngish infant, who, having been left motherless, had become what Mrs. Duffy called a bottle baby, and was in charge of a neighboring aunt. It seemed strange that this child, so eminently adapted to purposes of rental, was not offered to me at first, but I suppose the Irish ladies, who had the matter in charge, wanted to benefit themselves, or some of their near friends, before giving the general public of New Dublin a chance. The child suited me very well, and I agreed to take it for as many days as I might happen to want it, but to pay by the week in advance. It was a boy with a suggestion of orange-red bloom all over its head, and what looked to me like freckles on its cheeks, while its little nose turned up, even more than those of babies generally turn, above a very long upper lip. His eyes were blue and twinkling, and he had the very mouth for a little poipe, as Mrs. Hogan admirably remarked. He was hastily prepared for his trip, and when I had arranged the necessary business matters with his aunt, and had assured her that she could come and see him whenever she liked, I got into the carriage, and having spread the lap-robe over my knees, the baby, carefully wrapped in a little shawl, was laid in my lap. Then his bottle, freshly filled, for he might need a drink on the way, was tucked between the cushions on the seat beside me, and taking the other lines in my left hand, while I steadied my charge with the other, I prepared to drive away. "What's his name?" I asked. "It's Pat," said his aunt, "after his dad, who's away in the mines." "But ye can call him anything ye like," Mrs. Duffy remarked, "for he don't answer to his name yet." "Pat will do very well," I said as I bade the good woman farewell, and carefully guided the horse through the swarms of youngsters who had gathered around the carriage. Section 38.